In the fall of 1971, in a cold sale barn outside Cedar County, Iowa, a poultry buyer named Walt Hagen looked at a crate of dark, narrow-breasted birds and told the woman who raised them she was farming a museum. He was not unkind about it. He had a clipboard, a price sheet from the processor, and 40 years of numbers that all pointed one direction. And he tapped the sheet twice with his pen and said the broad-breasted bird put on twice the meat in half the time, and that anybody still running the old line was feeding a hobby with money she did not have. Then he wrote her a number on the bottom of the ticket, number so low it was almost a courtesy, and he moved down the alley to the next pen. 26 years later, in November of 1997, a kitchen steward from the executive residence in Washington placed a standing order for 40 of those same dark birds at a price per pound that Walt Hagen, had he still been alive to see it, would not have believed without holding the check in his own hands. This is the story of the years between those two moments, and of the woman who kept a line of turkeys alive when every voice she respected told her to let it die. Her name was Ada Ralston, and in 1971 she was 44 years old, and she had been raising poultry on the same 90 acres of East Iowa bottomlands since she was old enough to carry a feed bucket without spilling it. Stay with me, because the thing that saved her flock was the very thing the buyer counted against it, and it took a quarter-century and one bad winter to prove it. Ada was known in the county for two things. She talked less than any grown woman most people had met, and she could tell a sick bird from a healthy one across a yard at 50 feet, before the bird itself seemed to know. Let me tell you about the birds, because the birds are the whole argument. The turkey Walt Hagen wanted her to raise was the broad-breasted white, a bird engineered through the middle of the century to do one thing with great efficiency, which was to lay down breast meat fast. It grew so heavy in the chest, so quickly, that by the time it reached market weight it could barely walk, and it could not breed on its own at all. Every one of those birds came from artificial insemination, in a barn, under lights, on a schedule. It was a marvel of a certain kind of thinking. It turned feed into white meat at a ratio no older bird could match, and it did it on a calendar. A banker could plan around. The bird Ada kept was a different animal entirely. Her line traced back to the Bourbon Red, and the old bronze stock her grandmother had run before the First World War. Birds that flew up into the box elders to roost, that bred without a hand laid on them, that walked the pasture eating grasshoppers and clover and the cracked corn she scattered. They were lean through the breast and long in the leg. They were, by the only measure the processor used, a worse business in every respect, and Ada would not give them up. She had her reasons, and in 1971 she could not have told you all of them, because some of them she did not yet have words for. The ones she could name were simple. The old birds got sick less. They raised their own young without a heat lamp running the electric bill up through the winter. They did not need a vet on retainer. And they tasted. She said the one time anyone pressed her on it, like something, where the other bird tasted like the gravy you put on it. That was the whole of her defense. And to a man holding a processor price sheet, it sounded like sentiment dressed up as principle. Walt Hagen was not a villain in this story, and it would be a lie to make him one. He was a decent man who had watched the poultry business modernize in front of him and had helped 100 farmers in the county make the switch and come out ahead. He had seen families pull themselves off the edge of foreclosure by tearing out their old mixed flocks and putting up a long white barn full of uniform birds on contract. He believed, with the honest weight of a man who has seen his belief work again and again, that the kindest thing he could do for Ada Ralston was talk her out of her grandmother's turkeys before they took the farm down with them. When he called her line a museum, he meant it as a warning from a friend. The trouble was that he was measuring one thing, and the thing he could not measure was the thing that mattered. Let me tell you what the bottomland looked like in those years, because the place is part of the argument, too. Ada's 90 acres sat in a bend of a creek that flooded most springs, which was why the ground was cheap when her grandmother bought it, and why the neighbors with the good high prairie ground always looked a little down their noses at the Ralston place. The flooding deposited silt every year and left the pasture rich, and the box elders and the wild plum along the creek gave the turkeys shade and roost and cover from hawks. It was not ground you could run a big, efficient operation on. It flooded. It was uneven. It grew a dozen things instead of one. By the logic of the processor, it was as obsolete as the birds, and by the logic that would matter 25 years on, it was exactly the kind of place that survives. In 1972, her husband died. His name was Cliff, and he had farmed the row crop on the high 40 while Ada ran the poultry on the bottom, and his heart gave out behind the wheel of the tractor on a June afternoon, with the corn knee-high. A neighbor found the tractor stopped at the end of a row with the engine still running, and Cliff slumped over the wheel, and that was the end of the only partnership Ada had ever wanted. After that, the pressure to do the sensible thing got a great deal heavier. The note on the place was not large, but it was real, $4,000 in change against the bottom ground, and a widow. Running heritage turkeys at a year to finish was, in the plain arithmetic of the county, a woman managing a slow failure. Walt Hagen came by that fall, gentler than before, hat in his hands at the kitchen door, and told her there was a contract barn she could put up with financing he could help arrange, and that a year from now she would wonder why she had waited. He laid it out kindly and completely, the loan terms, the grower contract, the way the cash flow would steady out by the second cycle. He meant to rescue her. Ada thanked him for the coffee, walked him to his truck, and did not put up the barn. Here is where I want you to sit with the choice, because it is easy from where we sit now, knowing how it ends, to call it wisdom. It did not feel like wisdom in 1972. It felt like stubbornness, and the people who loved her said so. Her own brother told her she was letting a dead woman's birds bankrupt a living family. And Ada, who did not argue, went out in the dark of a December morning and walked through the roosting trees, counting her breeding stock by the sound of them shifting on the branches, and decided one more time to keep them. Let me tell you about the journal, because the journal is the inheritance more than the ground or the birds. Ada's grandmother, Marta, had kept a ledger from 1906 until the year she died, a thick canvas-bound book she wrote in with a carpenter's pencil. And it was not a book of accounts. It was book of observation. Which hens went broody and held the nest through a cold snap? Which toms threw strong-leg poults? Which birds shrugged off the sickness that swept the county in the bad years? And which went down? Marta had been breeding for something the whole time, slowly, one season at a time, and the thing she was breeding for was not size. It was the ability to survive without help. 60 years of notes in a carpenter's pencil, selecting every season for the hen that needed nothing from anybody. Ada had read that book so many times the spine had given out, and she had carried the work forward without ever once calling it a breeding program, because to her it was just paying attention. The journal taught a mechanism, and the mechanism is the heart of why this worked. So let me lay it out plainly. When you breed an animal for a single trait as hard and as fast as the industry bred the broad-breasted turkey for breast meat, You spend something to get it. The thing you spend is the genetic variety that lets a population absorb a shock. The white bird was, in effect, one bird, copied millions of times, every individual nearly identical to the next. That uniformity is precisely what made it efficient, and it is precisely what made it fragile. A flock that is all the same has no quiet reserve of individuals built a little differently, the few who happen to carry the resistance, the odd constitution, the trait nobody knew would matter until the year it did. Ada's flock, selected for 60 years toward hardiness, and never narrowed to a single type, was the opposite. It was a deep, varied, redundant population. It carried its reserves inside itself. To the buyer, that variety looked like inconsistency, like a failure to standardize. It was, in fact, insurance paid in advance, season after season, by women who never used the word. The middle of this story is long and quiet, and I am not going to pretend the quiet years were easy, because they were not. Through the 70s and into the 80s, Ada raised her birds and sold them where she could. To the few old families who still wanted a real turkey at Thanksgiving, to a butcher in Davenport named Lester Voss, who kept a short list of customers willing to pay double, to the occasional restaurant that came and went. Lester was a thick-armed man who had cut meat for 30 years and could feel quality through a paper wrap, and he was one of the few people in the world who understood without being told what Ada had. He would take a dozen of her birds in November and sell them quietly to a handful of doctors and lawyers who had grown up on real turkey and could not abide the other kind, and he would hand Ada an envelope of cash at his back door and tell her every single year that she was the last sane poultry farmer in the state. It was not enough money to change anything, it was enough to keep going, which in those years was the only victory on offer. She made a living. She did not get ahead. There were Decembers when the note came due and the turkey money had already gone to feed and fence wire, and Ada would sell a few breeding hens she would rather have kept to a farmer 2 counties over who wanted to start his own small flock, and she would tell herself it was spreading the line and not just paying the bank, which was true, and which also did not entirely take the sting out of it. Every November she sold most of the year's crop, and every December she walked the roosting trees in the cold and kept her breeders the strongest hens and the soundest toms, exactly as Marta had taught the book to teach her. She would go out before light with a lantern, though she did not need the light to count, and she would stand under the box elders and listen, and she could tell you without seeing them which hens were on the branch and which tom held the high roost, and she would mark in her head the ones that would breed in the spring. It was not a chore she did, it was a conversation she kept up, with the birds and with her grandmother and with the ground itself, year after year, while the county decided she was slowly going under. Let me tell you about the man who took the other road, because his road is the one most people took, and he deserves to be remembered with sympathy and not as a lesson. His name was Roy Tasker, and he farmed 2 miles east, and in 1974 he tore out a mixed flock his own father had run and put up a long white contract barn, 80 feet by 400, financed to the rafters, and filled it with broad-breasted birds on a grower contract with the processor. Roy had done his homework, he had gone to the meetings, he had run the numbers with the same extension people Walt Hagen worked alongside, and the numbers had told him a clear and honest story. A contract barn would finish a bird in 14 weeks instead of Ada's full year. It would convert feed to meat at nearly twice the rate. It would give him a guaranteed buyer and a guaranteed price and a schedule he could borrow against. For a man with a family and a mortgage, it was not a gamble. It was the responsible thing, and Roy was a responsible man. For a while, Roy Tasker was the picture of a man who had done the smart thing. He had a new truck, a half-ton with the dealer's sticker barely off the window. He had a number he could count on, a check from the processor every cycle, regular as the seasons used to be, before regularity moved indoors. He paid his note, down ahead of schedule the first 2 years. He put a daughter through college on contract turkeys. When the two of them passed on the gravel road, Roy would lift 2 fingers off the wheel in the country wave, and there was, in those years, a little pity in it, the pity of a man doing well for a neighbor who would not come in out of the past. He was not cruel about it. Once at the grain elevator, he told Ada there was room in the contract program if she ever wanted in, and he said it the way you offer a hand to someone you are watching struggle. Ada thanked him and said her birds did better in the trees. Roy laughed not unkindly and let it go. He thought she was sentimental. He had no way of knowing he was the one exposed, and neither did she. Not yet. Not for 20 more years. Around the middle of the 80s, Ada's granddaughter came to live on the place, and she is the one who nearly talked Ada out of everything, and the one who, in the end, carried it forward. Her name was Jenna. She was 23, and she had a degree in agricultural economics from the State University, which is to say she had been trained for 2 years in exactly the kind of thinking Walt Hagen carried on his clipboard. Jenna loved her grandmother and was quietly horrified by her grandmother's business. She did the math on the heritage birds, the feed conversion, the year to finish, the labor, the price, and the math was not kind. She filled a legal pad with it. She sat at the kitchen table under the one hanging light, the table Cliff had built from a walnut that came down on the property, and she laid the legal pad in front of Ada and made the case the whole county had been making for 15 years, except she made it with figures and a future she could see clearly. What Jenna said, in the kindest version, was that there was no path on paper where the old birds won. Ada listened to all of it. Then she said one thing which Jenna wrote in the margin of the legal pad and kept for the rest of her life. Ada said the paper measures the year. It does not measure the bad year. Jenna did not understand it then. She thought it was the kind of thing old people say to end a conversation they are losing. She stayed anyway, because she loved the place, and she started keeping her own records alongside Marta's old journal. And somewhere in the keeping of those records a thing happened that no argument could have done. She began to see the pattern her grandmother saw. The first season she kept her own count. She expected the textbook losses, the numbers her professors had drilled into her, the heavy poult mortality that justified every heat lamp and every intervention the modern operation depended on. The losses did not come. She watched the heritage hens go broody and settle on their nests and hold them through a cold April rain that should have chilled the clutches, and she watched them bring off poults at a survival rate the book said was impossible without a brooder house and a thermostat. She wrote the number down twice, because she did not believe it the first time. She watched a respiratory bug move through the flock the second spring, the kind of thing that empties a contract barn, and she braced for it, and most of the birds simply shook it off and kept eating. A few of the weaker ones went down, and Ada culled those few without sentiment, the way she always had, and Jenna understood slowly that the culling was not cruelty and was not waste. It was the whole method. Every bird that could not make it without help was a bird that did not breed, and 90 years of that quiet arithmetic was sitting in the trees along the creek, walking around, looking like an accident. She started writing in the canvas journal herself, in ballpoint, under the carpenter's pencil, careful at first, as if she were writing in a church, and the doubt she had brought to the kitchen table slowly turned into something closer to wonder, though she would not have admitted it for a long while yet. She kept the legal pad, too, the one with all her economics on it, and she looked at it sometimes, and the figures had not changed. The birds were still a bad business on paper. She was only beginning to understand that the paper was not the territory, and that her grandmother had been farming the territory the whole time. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something, the way you might ask the person sitting next to you in a truck on a long drive. If everyone you trusted told you the thing you loved was going to ruin you, and they had the numbers to prove it, how many years could you hold the line? Ada held it for 25. Stay with me, because the year that proved her right is coming, and it came the way these things always come, from a direction nobody was watching. The label followed her the whole time. In 1971, it was a museum. In 1983, at a county extension meeting where Ada sat in the back row, a young state poultry specialist with a slide projector put up a chart of feed conversion ratios and, gesturing at the antique end of the scale, the kind of thing that was fine as a sideline for a hobbyist but a danger to anyone trying to make a living. He did not know Ada was in the room. Someone told him afterward, and he was embarrassed, and he found her by the coffee and said he had not meant her specifically, and Ada said she knew what he meant and that it was all right, and let him off the hook he had hung himself on. She had heard it too many times to spend feeling on it. Let me tell you what those broad-breasted barns were actually built on, because the fragility was not a flaw in one farmer's management. It was built into the whole system by design, and the design optimized away the very thing that protects a population. Every contract barn in the county ran the same genetics, the same feed, the same ventilation, the same schedule, and they did it because uniformity is what makes a thing efficient to manage and finance and process. The specialist with the slide projector was right that it converted feed to meat better than anything in history. He was right about the number he was measuring. What he was not measuring, what the whole apparatus had no column for, was what happens to a uniform population when something arrives that the uniform population has no answer to. In the winter of 1996 and into the spring of 1997, that something arrived. It came as a strain of avian influenza, and I am going to be careful here and tell it the way it happened, through numbers and consequences rather than through any scene of suffering, because the suffering is not the point, and the arithmetic is. The strain moved through the upper Midwest poultry industry in a way the modern flocks were exquisitely unprepared for, not because anyone was careless, because the birds were all the same. A virus that found a way into one broad-breasted barn had found a way into all of them, since every bird in every barn was, genetically, nearly the same bird. There was no reserve of the differently built, no quiet minority carrying a resistance, nothing for the population to fall back on. The barns that took it lost almost everything in them. The standard response, the only response, was to depopulate the affected flocks entirely and start over, and across the region the losses ran into the millions of birds. Roy Tasker lost his barn that spring, 80 feet by 400, financed to the rafters, and over the course of about 10 days it went from a going concern to an empty building he was still making payments on. 19,000 birds, the whole barn gone in a week and a half, and the building stood there afterward, washed down and silent, the fans still turning over an empty floor. He was 61. He had done everything the smart money told him to do for 23 years, and he had done it well, and a thing he could not see and could not have fought took all of it because the system that made him efficient had also made him fragile, and he had never been told that was the trade. He came over to Ada's place once that summer, not for any reason he could name, and stood at the fence looking at her birds moving in the pasture, the dark, varied flock that had come through the same season that emptied his barn, and he did not say much. He asked her finally how many she had lost. Ada told him the truth. She had lost some. Most had held. Roy nodded slowly and looked at the birds a while longer and said, "Your grandmother knew something, didn't she?" And Ada said she did, and that was the whole conversation. When I tell you to feel for Roy Tasker, I mean it. He was not foolish. He was faithful to advice that was sound right up until the year it wasn't. Ada's flock did not take it the same way. Some of her birds got sick. This is the part that matters, so I am going to say it carefully. Her flock was not magic, and it was not untouchable. What it was varied. The virus moved into her birds and met a population that was not all the same. A population 60 years selected for the Constitution to survive without help, and it did not find the open road it found in the barns. Some birds went down. Most did not. The ones that carried the older, tougher genetics. The ones Marta and then Ada had been quietly selecting for since 1906 came through. The flock as a whole absorbed the shock, the way a varied thing absorbs a shock and a uniform thing cannot. By summer, Ada had a breeding population intact. By the standards of that terrible spring, intact was a kind of fortune that could not be bought. Because up and down the region, there were operations with far more money than Ada Ralston had ever seen that could not buy back what they had lost at any price. Word of that travels in a small world. The world of people who care about heritage poultry is not large, and in the wreckage of that spring it became suddenly intensely interested in the few flocks that had come through with their genetics whole. A man named Dr. Soren Vance, a poultry geneticist with a federal conservation program, drove out to the bottomland in July of 1997 to see the Ralston flock for himself, because a flock that had passed through that strain and kept its breeding stock was, to a scientist, not a museum at all. It was a living bank. It was a reserve of exactly the genetic variety the industry had spent 50 years breeding out of its own birds, sitting in the box elders along a creek in Cedar County, kept alive by a woman who had been told for 25 years to give it up. Let me tell you about the afternoon Soren Vance spent on the place, because it is where the two kinds of knowledge finally stood in the same yard. He came with instruments and a laptop and a way of speaking that was all measurement, a tall, careful man who chose his words like a man counting change. He had expected, he admitted later, to spend an hour, take a few samples, and drive back to the university. He stayed until dark. Ada walked him through the pasture and the roosting trees and told him things in plain words that his instruments confirmed an hour later. She told him which line threw the broody hens, the ones off the creek end stock, and he found it in the records and then found it again in his samples. She told him the birds along the creek carry the old bronze constitution, heavier boned, slower, tougher in the lung, and his testing bore it out down to the marker. She pointed at a hen 40 feet off and told him that one would breed true and that one beside it would not, and she could not have told him how she knew, and he stopped asking how after the third time she was right. He had come to study a curiosity, and he stayed to take notes from a master. He kept saying small, astonished things to himself, the way a man does when the world is larger than his training prepared him for. At one point, he knelt in the pasture and turned over a clutch of feathers and looked up at her and said, "Most of what we conserve in a freezer, in straws of semen and vials, because the live populations are gone." He said, "You have a live population." He said, "Do you understand how rare that is?" Ada said she understood it was rare to him, and that to her it was just the birds which had always been there, and would go on being there as long as somebody paid attention. At the end of the day, he sat at the walnut table with Marta's journal open in front of him, 90 years of a carpenter's pencil and a ballpoint, turning the soft pages with one finger, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing the whole story had been waiting for somebody qualified to say. He said, "This flock is more valuable than any barn in this county, and I can prove it." The proof came in November, and it came as a number, and it came from a direction that made the number land twice as hard. Dr. Vance had connections in a world Ada had never touched. The world of chefs and stewards who in the 90s were beginning to hunt down exactly the kind of real food the industry had spent decades engineering out of existence. He made a call. He told a colleague who told a chef who, as it happened, cooked for the executive residence in Washington, that there was a flock of true heritage turkeys in Iowa that had survived the year that killed the others, birds that tasted like the thing itself and not like the gravy on it. And in November of 1997, a kitchen steward from the White House placed a standing order with Ada Ralston for 40 turkeys for the season at a price per pound she had to ask him to repeat, $11 a pound. She wrote it on the back of the same kind of sale ticket Walt Hagen had once used to write her a number that was almost a courtesy. $11 a pound, live weight equivalent, for the birds a buyer had valued at a fraction of that in a cold barn 26 years before. Ada sat at the walnut table with the ticket in her hand and did not say anything for a while. Jenna was the one who broke. Jenna, who had brought the legal pad to that table a decade earlier and proved on paper that the old birds could not win, put her face in her hands and cried because she understood at last what her grandmother had meant. The paper measures the year. It does not measure the bad year. And the bad year had come, and the only flock left standing was the one the paper had condemned. I want to be careful about the number, because it would be easy to let $11 a pound be the whole point, and it is not. The number mattered because of what it confirmed, not because of what it bought. It confirmed that the thing Ada had protected was not sentiment, it was value of a kind. The system simply had no instrument to read, until a shock came that the system could not survive, and hers could. The $11 was the market finally pricing in the bad year, the way Ada had been pricing it in quietly for a quarter of a century, every December in the cold, by the sound of her breeders shifting in the trees. Walt Hagen had died in 1989, and so he never saw it, and I find I am sorry about that because he was a good man who was wrong, and the story would be kinder if he had been there to see the correction. The man who did see it, the man who stood in for all the confident voices, was the state poultry specialist from the 1983 extension meeting, the one who had called the heritage breeds a boutique liability with a slide projector behind him. His name was Phil Conway, and by 1998 he was running the extension office for that district. And when the story of the Ralston flock and the White House order moved through the agricultural press, he understood exactly whose flock it was. He drove out to the bottomland in the spring of 1998. He did not bring a slide projector. He brought a notebook and he asked Ada if he could write down how she had done it, and Ada, who had let him off his hook 15 years before, poured him a cup of coffee and answered every question he had. That is the recalibration this kind of story turns on, and I want to mark what it was and what it was not. Phil Conway was not humiliated. He was corrected, and he had the character to let the correction in, and he spent the back half of his career arguing in extension meetings for the conservation of heritage breeds as a matter of food security, telling a chart and projector profession that the cheapest bird, the harshest doubter, became the most useful student. That is the better ending, and it is the one Ada's story actually had. Let me tell you what Ada did with the years that followed, because what she did with them is the moral center of the whole thing, more than any number. She did not scale up. She had every chance to. There were people with money who wanted to take the Ralston line and put it into a real operation, who saw $11 a pound and wanted to multiply it. Ada turned them down, every one, and she turned them down, for the same reason she had kept the birds in the first place. The thing that made the flock valuable was the thing that could not be scaled. Slow, patient selection on one piece of ground by people who knew every bird, and the moment you scaled it, you would lose the very thing you were trying to sell. She understood this completely. She had understood it before she had words for it. What she did instead was give it away in the only way that kept it alive. She sold breeding stock and hatching eggs at fair prices, and never inflated ones, to other small farmers who wanted to raise a real bird, and she kept a list in the back of a spiral notebook, names and states and how many eggs went where and which line they came from. A young couple in Missouri took 24 eggs and a pair of breeders, and started a flock that is still going. A retired schoolteacher in Wisconsin, who had eaten a real turkey once as a child and never forgotten it, drove down with a dog crate and went home with 6 poults and a page of Ada's instructions written out in her square, plain hand. Over the next decade, the Ralston line went out to dozens of small flocks across a dozen states. A hen here, a setting of eggs there. Never a truckload, never a deal, always a person Ada had talked to long enough to be sure they would keep the birds the right way. She was not building a business. She was building redundancy. The same insurance her flock carried inside itself spread now across the country, so that no single bad year, no single barn fire, no single bad strain of anything could take it. A geneticist would have called it ex situ conservation, the safeguarding of a population by distributing it across many sites. Ada called it making sure the birds did not all live in one place, which is the same thing said by someone who actually understood it. She had watched what happened to a population that all lived in one place, all built the same way. The spring Roy Tasker's barn went empty, and she had decided her grandmother's 90 years would never sit exposed like that in a single bend of a single creek. So she scattered it on purpose, the way the old birds scattered their own genetics by breeding without a hand laid on them, and the scattering was the whole point, and she gave Jenna the journal. Not when she died, which was not for many years yet, but while she was alive and could watch what Jenna did with it. She took the canvas-bound book, 90 years of carpenter's pencil and ballpoint, and she put it in her granddaughter's hands at the walnut table under the hanging light, and she told her to keep writing in it. Jenna kept writing in it. She runs the Ralston flock still on the same 90 acres of bottomland in the bend of the creek, and she has filled the back half of Marta's book and started a second, and she sells breeding stock to small farmers and turns down the people who want to scale it, and she teaches young people who come to the place the one thing the whole story comes down to, which is how to tell a sound bird from a failing one across a yard, before the bird itself seems to know. Let me tell you the last thing, and then I will let the story rest. There is a thing worth saying plainly at the end of a story like this about the 2 kinds of knowing that stood in Ada's yard. There is a knowledge that is wide and fast and confident, that measures what can be measured, and is genuinely good at it, that turns feed into meat on a calendar, a banker can plan around, and there is a knowledge that is narrow and slow and quiet, that lives in one place and one set of hands across a lifetime. That pays attention to the things no column has a name for. The first kind built the barns and fed a nation cheaply, and was not wrong to do it. The second kind kept a reserve the first kind had thrown away, and when the year came that the first kind could not survive, the second kind was the only thing left standing. We do not have to choose between them as a matter of pride. We only have to remember that the system measures the year, and that somebody, somewhere, on some unfashionable piece of ground, had better be measuring the bad year, because the bad year always comes. Ada lived to be 91. Near the end, when she could not walk the pasture any more, Jenna would help her to a chair on the porch in the late afternoon, and the turkeys would come up from the creek in the long amber light, the dark bronze and the deep red of the old line, walking the way they had always walked, and one old Tom in particular. A bird Jenna had named Gideon, for no reason either of them could remember, would come right up to the porch step and stand by Ada's boot the way he had done for years. She would put her hand down on his back and he would let her, and the two of them would sit there in the light that comes off the bottomland in the fall, the woman and the bird, while the rest of the flock moved up through the box elders to roost. She never once called herself rich, and she never once said she had been right. She did not have to. The birds came up from the creek every evening, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. What is rigid breaks, and what is varied endures, and the wealth that lasts is the kind that lives in many hands and not in any one column on a page.